Welcome to part 5 on the road to secession. Now we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850. Sectional tension mile marker number 9 had to do with the creation of another abolitionist or anti-slavery political party. This time, the Free Soil Party, right? It's going to form in 1848, and it's going to be a combination of barn burners, these are anti-slavery Democrats, Whigs, and Liberty Party members, because if you remember, the Liberty Party is going to kind of self-destruct in 1848. Now, they are going to choose for a political candidate for president a old standard bearer, right? The protege of Andrew Jackson and his successor, Martin Van Buren, right? And to try and bolster their candidacy, they're also going to select the son of John Quincy Adams, a staunch abolitionist in the House of Representatives, Charles Francis Adams, right? John Quincy Adams, after his presidency, had gone back in the House and was always a very powerful anti-slavery orator on the floor of the House. Matter of fact, this same year in 1848, in the middle of giving an anti-slavery speech on the floor of the House, he is going to have a stroke and collapse and die a couple days later. Now, the Free Soil Party will be kind of a one-hit wonder there. They will only last one political cycle. They'll be a little bit more successful than the Liberty Party, but they will set the stage for the Republican Party, which will rise up behind them and will be a successful anti-slavery party. By 1850, though, the issue of slavery is becoming a central political issue. It's the only thing people can talk about. And so enter one last time Henry Clay, the great compromiser. He is going to try one more time to put this issue of slavery off for another generation. Matter of fact, with what he comes up with this time, he hopes to put slavery off for 100 years. Today we refer to as the Compromise of 1850, right? It's not what they called it back then. Henry Clay comes up with such an expansive series of compromises that he comes up with something that would be impossible to get passed through both houses. So Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois is actually going to take Henry Clay's proposal, and he's going to log roll it into something that will pass, right? And then it's going to be presented to the House and the Senate. And in the Senate, this is going to be the last meeting of perhaps the three greatest members of that body. Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, right? Now, these men come from different political backgrounds and have different political stances, especially on slavery, but yet they're all going to argue in favor of this bill. They all see it as a valid and legitimate compromise solution. Henry Clay will speak on February 5th and 6th, 1850, and he warns the Senate what might happen if they don't get this bill passed. He says, "Sir, I implore you gentlemen to pause, solemnly to pause at the edge of the precipice, before the fearful and dangerous leap be taken into the yawning abyss below, from which none who have ever taken it shall return in safety." You know, he basically warns, if we don't get this passed, there will be civil war, right? John C. Calhoun is also going to argue on this bill in a speech that's given on March 4th, 1850. John C. Calhoun's speech will say, "How can the Union be saved? To this I answer, there is but one way by which it can be saved, and that is by adopting such measures that will satisfy the states belonging to the southern section so that they can remain in the Union consistently with their honor and safety." Now, I said that's a speech of John C. Calhoun, but both these men are at the twilight of their political career, and honestly, John C. Calhoun is sick. He is literally in the process of dying as they are working on getting this bill passed. Matter of fact, what had happened was on March 4th, 1850, they literally wheeled his dying butt onto the floor of the Senate. James Mason of Virginia stood next to him and gave Calhoun's speech because he couldn't talk himself. He just sat there wrapped in a blanket, kind of shaking, right? And after the speech, they wheeled him off. He's going to be dead by March 31st. And Henry Clay, too, he's only going to survive 2 years, 1852. He will finally die as well. The third of these men is going to be Daniel Webster. Obviously anti-slavery as opposed to John C. Calhoun's pro-slavery, but he is also going to support this bill. And he's going to talk about the issue of secession. And he says, secession? Peaceable secession? Sir, your eyes and mine are never destined to see that miracle. The dismemberment of this vast country without convulsion? The breaking up of the fountains of the great deep without ruffling the surface? Who is so foolish, I beg everyone's pardon, as to expect to see such a thing? This was on March 7th, 1850. Now, Daniel Webster is also on his way out. He's going to leave the Senate and become Secretary of State. And by October of 1852, he too will be dead. So by 1852, all three of these men are gone. And Henry Clay dies thinking, they got this bill pushed through. It's like, yes, I did it. I put the issue of slavery off for the next 100 years. We're not going to talk about this again until 1950. He'll die believing that. So it makes you ask, I'm sure, what the heck is in this bill? Well, the Compromise of 1850's got a little bit of everything for everyone. It's important provisions, though. For the North, California in the Mexican Secession will be added as a free state. They'll draw the boundaries based on the known census data at the time, which is why California is so big, right? And of course, the anti-slavery people want California to be as big as humanly possible, to take as much territory of that Mexican Secession as you can. The slave trade, not slavery, but the slave trade will be abolished in Washington, D.C. One of the biggest problems that people, especially on the floor of the House, had was right across the street from the side that the house was on was a slave auction house, right? And so you literally would have John Quincy Adams in the summertime giving an anti-slavery speech. The doors are open, there's no air conditioning yet, and you could literally hear the slave auction going on. Another important provision was the western boundary of Texas was set to where you see it today, right? Which shrunk the size of Texas. Remember, Texas felt the Rio Grande all the way to its headwaters was its territory, right? Matter of fact, they'll call it the Great Texan Bribery, right? So this creates more territory open to be just labeled part of the Mexican Secession. It expanded into Mexico territory. Now, for the South, this is what the South gets. The rest of the Mexican Secession, with the exception of California, and of course Texas, which is already brought in as a slave state, is going to be open to slavery based on popular sovereignty. Remember, Stephen Douglas's brainchild here. That's why I have a picture of him on here. Texas will be paid $10 million for the territory lost, hence why they called it the Great Texas Bribery. And then finally, a tougher Federal Fugitive Slave Act, right? Something to replace the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which is being flaunted by the North. All right, so everybody got something, but here's the thing. That Fugitive Slave Act is going to be the most disruptive. And so while Henry Clay thinks he's pushed this off 100 years, that Fugitive Slave Act is going to push it off 4. When you look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it is incredible. I mean, it's amazing that any Northerner didn't just home in on this right away and say, this is absolutely unacceptable. Here's the provisions of it. First, it authorized federal commissioners following a hearing to issue warrants for the arrest of fugitive slaves and certificates to return them to their owners. All right, that's not very different from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. But it gets worse. An affidavit by the slave owner was considered sufficient proof of ownership. That's all you had to provide. But it gets worse. For the accused fugitive, they do not have the right to a trial by jury, and their testimony stating that I am not a slave, or escaped slave, is not admissible as evidence. They're not allowed to defend themselves. But it gets worse. If the commissioner did not grant the certificate to return the alleged escaped slave to its owner, he would receive a fee for $5 for his time. But if he did grant the certificate, he would receive a fee of $10. He would receive twice as much. I'm not going to say that biases the courts, but I think that might bias the courts. You know, what if it's around Christmas? Maybe Timmy needs that operation. I don't know. Okay, but it gets worse. The commissioners could require any bystanders to help them catch escaped fugitives, right? They just could deputize them on the spot. Remember, Pennsylvania said, well, it's a federal responsibility, so you don't have to do it. Federal authority, federal marshal comes in and says, I now have I have now commissioned you as a federal officer. Let's go. You could even go to, prominent abolitionists and have them do it as well. You could refuse, but if you do, guess what? It gets worse. Anybody who refused faced severe penalties. You'd be fined $1,000. Think about it. That's a lot of money back then. And you would be forced to pay the owner of the escaped slave $1,000 for each slave you didn't help catch. So you're out at least $2,000 now. And you could go to jail for 6 months, right? So it's not surprising that this Fugitive Slave Act is going to outrage Northerners. So here's our landscape in 1850, right? We have the Missouri Compromise that has the unorganized remains of the Louisiana Territory still slated as free. You have the slave state of Texas, Indian Territory, Oklahoma Territory is considered slave territory. California is free territory. Oregon was never really a question. It was always going to be kind of free. Slavery just didn't take hold there. And then you had the remainder of the Mexican Secession, which has now been split into two and opened up to popular sovereignty. Things, though, are going to continue to escalate down this road towards secession.